Good evening, everybody. It's much easier on my nerves when you're all in the dark. It's much more palatable. And thankfully, Willard and Holly are up front to give me some courage here. But it's so wonderful to see all you guys, man. Thank you all for making your time. You guys I know have really busy schedules, but public intellectualism is one of my favorite things, and I'm glad that it's still a hot spot. My name is Emerson Sestair, and along with my parents, we're the current stewards of the Toadstool bookshops here in town. And before we reel off the really lengthy accomplishments, I could have gone for 4 pages here of our interlocutors tonight. I wanted to take a moment to thank all of our wonderful partners who worked to make this event possible, all of whom are present at the back of the room and in the entrance. So thank you very much to Dory Drockman and Mike Lambert of Prep and Hub. Thank you to Maria Finnegan of Moms for Clean Air. And thank you to Rebecca Springer of W.W. Norton, as well as the Toadstool staff, Lowell, Peter, Anna, Nadia, Eric, and Jeff. So our first speaker tonight is Matthew Bolton. He's an author, teacher, filmmaker. He's the creative director and producer at the award-winning SALT Project Film Studios in Keene, a graduate of Northwestern University, Harvard Divinity School, and the University of Chicago Divinity School. He's served on the faculty at Harvard and as president of the Christian Theological Seminary. We're very grateful for being our moderator tonight, as I have a sneaking suspicion that those who commune with God are going to be our best hope at understanding these two. Thank you very much for that. I appreciate that. Alan Weisman has worked on 7 continents in the Caribbean and Oceania and in more than 60 countries. Author Louise Erdrich called his book Hope Dies Last, a book of heroism, courage, and selfless love, the exact book we need to fight for our place on earth. Alan's 2007 book, The World Without Us, was a New York Times and international bestseller, a finalist for the National Book Critics Circle Award, and the Rachel Carson Prize. In 2020, Slate named it one of the top 50 nonfiction books of the last 25 years, and it was chosen as one of the top nonfiction books of 2007 by Time Magazine, Entertainment Weekly, and most illustriously, Canada's National Post. It's also been translated into 34 languages. Alan has a mercifully short Wikipedia page with this absolute iconic line that I don't know if it's actually Alan who put it in there, but
I didn't know I had one.
there's a line in Alan's personal life blurb that says, "Though many call Alan a misanthrope, Weisman asserts that he is not." And that's the end of the quote. Additionally, in that section, it says, Alan is a firm believer that birds are not the only thing that sing on this planet. And whether or not he said that, once you read his prose, you will also believe that. Finally, Bill McKibben is the author of over a dozen books, including the award-winning and perennial best-selling The End of Nature. He was awarded the Gandhi Peace Prize in 2013. Foreign Policy magazine named him to its inaugural list of 100 most important global thinkers in 2009. And MSN named him one of a dozen most influential men in 2009. In 2010, the Boston Globe called him probably the nation's leading environmentalist.
Probably.
Time Magazine did him one better by describing him as the world's best green journalist. So thank you all for being here, and I'll leave it up to them.
So it isn't only birds who sing. Little darling, it's been a long, cold, lonely winter. Little darling, it seems like years since it's been here. Sing it out. Here comes the sun, doo-doo-doo-doo. Here comes the sun, and I say it's all right to doo-doo-doo-doo-doo-doo-doo-doo-doo-doo-doo. Little darling, I feel the ice is slowly melting, which isn't always good. Little darling, it seems like years since it's been clear. Now sing it out like you mean it. Here comes the sun, doo-doo-doo-doo. Here comes the sun, and I say it's all right to doo-doo-doo-doo-doo. Give yourselves a round of applause. My name is Matt. I'm on the board of the Monadnock Sustainability Hub, which is one of the hosts tonight, along with the Peterborough Renewable Energy Project, PREP, and Toadstool. One more round of applause for all three of those. So we're going to begin with action. I have a sense we're going to end with action too. But we're going to begin with action, which is that on September 27, there is an energy fair being put on by the Hub and by PREP. It alternates years. It's in Keene, then it's in Peterborough, then it's in Keene. This year it's in Peterborough at the Peterborough Elementary School. And you might be thinking to yourself, why would I go to an energy fair? The answer is you don't want to miss this one. You can meet vendors who will show you, and you'll hear about this tonight, the amazing technologies that are leading the clean energy transition all over the world. This is one of the stories that future historians will talk about. They'll actually talk about this energy fair, actually. I'm kind of serious about that because we're part of this global transition. So that's one reason to come. The second reason to come is there's going to be nonprofits there who are helping with that transition, and we got to help those nonprofits too, right? Somebody said yes, absolutely. And then the third reason is because there's going to be games and stuff for kids, and there's going to be food trucks, good energy all around. So that's Saturday, the 27th of September, Peterborough Elementary School. And then that's at the end of that energy week. At the beginning is Sunday, and we're going to hear more about that, but there's going to be a big event in Keene on Sunday, 1 to 4 p.m. There's also going to be a hike, a sunrise hike here in Peterborough, and then some folks are going to Concord to do Sunday in Concord. That's the 21st, of course, of September. Some folks are coming to Keene. So please come to one of those or all of those events, participate in that action. It's very important. We want to get to these two gentlemen, of course. Alan's going to kick us off. But I just wanted to say this is the best place in the country for this conversation to have. I can't imagine a better thing to do on a Monday night. But this is a mill town. We know something in our bones about energy and energy transition in a mill town. American energy doesn't happen in one chapter, it happens in multiple chapters. And a new chapter is beginning, right? There's water, wood, water, coal, oil and gas. Now there's something new. The question is, will we be left behind? Can we participate in turning that page? And then the second thing is, speaking of pages, is the library. Lays claim to be the country's first free library. In other words, a library where you don't have to pay to take the books out. In other words, the town came together and said that knowledge doesn't belong to the rich. It belongs to everyone. The truth belongs to everyone. So we got a mill town and a free library, energy and knowledge. This is the perfect place for this conversation with these two gentlemen. So, without further ado or any more singing, at least for now, unless Alan wants to lead us in a song, please welcome Alan Weisman to the podium.
Thank you all for being here. Thank you for the invitation for us to be here. A few years ago, this was before pre-pandemic, my editor and I spent about a year on the phone trying to decide what my next book should be. And by the end of every conversation, he would say, "Man, do you think there's any hope left?" So finally we decided maybe that's the book. But I wasn't interested in just, oh yeah, I'm going to just think about good things and feel hopeful about it. I want to know what our realistic hopes were. Because as I explained to my editor, it would be bad enough if we were facing an existential crisis on this planet. In fact, we're facing three. The unmoored climate, which Bill will talk about presently, an extinction event that is going to be one of join the 5 previous major extinction events in the history of this planet. And those two are very much connected to one another because of the third existential problem that we have, which is the number of people that we have on the planet, all of them addicted to two substances, one of them being energy, which again Bill is going to talk about, the other one being food. We all need it, and unfortunately the way that we grow it for so many people has become a vicious cycle because it's exacerbating both of those earlier problems, those prior problems, climate change and extinction. So what I set out to find is, given all of that, what are our realistic hopes for getting through this make or break century that we are in and coming out the other side with a livable arrangement on this planet for our species. Some of you know my book, The World Without Us. I didn't write that book because I want a world without us. I wrote it because I want one with us. In that book, I theoretically just wipe us out and see what happens. And what happens is that nature responds with surprising swiftness, and even if it takes a few million years, it eventually refills all the niches, and as it will do with the niches that we have inadvertently emptied. I hoped that readers would take away from that, wow, this beautiful restored planet, is there any way that we could add ourselves back to that picture, only in some kind of workable balance and not the mortal combat that we are in right now? Because that is what we are in right now. So I set out on this blind mission to find out what realistic hopes are. It took me to 12 different countries, many trips within our own country, and it took me to places and to people who I don't normally talk to. I mean, I had a lot of fun covering the conservation side of this thing because I enjoy being in the fields with ecologists. They're the ones who taught me how to write more than any writing professor, because they explained to me that everything on this planet is connected. And if I could explain those connections to readers, readers would intuitively say, yeah, I get that. The problem with trying to find, where hope lies, though, meant that these connections, I had to look at a whole lot of other people than just the ones who hang out in nature. And I ended up spending time with engineers. I ended up spending time with military people. I ended up spending time with religious authorities. A big gamut. I'm going to tell you briefly about two or three of the stories that are in the book. But what I discovered in all these different walks of life, in all these different places, was that all these people had something in common. And that thing was they refused to quit. They were absolutely stubbornly committed to find us a way to the future. And as one of them described to me, he says, I can't wait around for miracles. I have to go out and make miracles. Amazingly, they were able to do that. And I found that these people, by the end of the book, I found myself so uplifted by them that they got me to believe that this ain't over. So I begin the book in a place that is loaded with symbolism. I begin it at the top of the Persian Gulf, where the Tigris and Euphrates come together, form one river, and they flow into the sea. This was an area that in the Pleistocene times was the top third of the Persian Gulf was above ground because so much of the Earth's moisture was locked up in glaciers. And you had actually 4 rivers. The Bible describes 4 rivers coming together at this spot: the Tigris, Euphrates, the Karun, and the Wadi al-Badi. They have different names in the Bible. But it was a quadruple river delta that our hunter-gatherer ancestors must have found a paradise. And there was the birth of a story that started with the Sumerians and then the Akkadians, and then it eventually came up to the Hebrews. But it's the same story. But also very interestingly is that as civilization was forming and these people hunted and gathered, and then they discovered that some of the stuff that they gathered, if they dropped it, it would all sprout in one place, and they said, oh, that makes life easier. And catching, instead of killing those animals, you could catch them and you could wrap some vines around trees and you could corral them. And civilization was born in this area. But at the same time, at the end of the Pleistocene, the glaciers were starting to recede. And as they melted, the sea started coming up. And every generation, they were moving back kilometers and kilometers. So in all of those cultures that I mentioned before, we also have a flood story. So I went to this area, this cradle of civilization, because for one thing, it's getting so hot there, it may become unlivable. And if the cradle of our civilization and of three major religions becomes too hot to inhabit, that's got to be telling us something. But also I went there because where the Tigris and the Euphrates as floodplains meet, is the biggest wetland in the Middle East, a very vital ecosystem for all these migratory and endemic species. During the 1990s, in between the two Gulf Wars, Saddam Hussein built diversion dikes, diverted the Tigris and Euphrates away from it to flush out Shiite rebels by letting this incredible wetland die. And it was so desiccated, it just turned to brown dust. It was considered to be completely irreparable, completely unrecoverable. But a civil engineer, an Iraqi civil engineer, who had grown up fishing those marshes before he went to school there and then was forced into exile, returned after, and he wanted to resuscitate the marshes. And he was living in the United States. He tried to get the US State Department that had financed those wars to finance the resuscitation. He couldn't get any takers. The biologists all told him that it just couldn't be resuscitated. And he asked a question that I heard time and time and time again while I was working on this book, which is, how do you know if you don't try? Because if we don't try, failure is assured. So he couldn't raise the money. And he, in despair, working with another civil engineer, they were standing on top of the dike one day watching people with picks and shovels trying to open it. And they realized, we don't need to raise all this international funding to let's just go rent an earth mover. So for $30, they rent an earth mover, and they punch 3 holes in it, and all the water comes rushing back in. And then for 6 weeks, it stunk to high heavens. And it was just like, oh my God, what have we done? But then these green shoots started appearing along the sides. And then within a few months, the marshes were green again. And then there were herons and there were ibises that were coming back, kingfishers, and that meant that the fish had returned. And then also the Madan people returned. These were indigenous people who are directly descended from the Sumerians. They live in these reed-hooped houses as they've been living since the time of the biblical Adam and Eve. And now this area is, again, a home, a vital home to migratory species and to the livelihood of over 50,000 people who have their water buffalo there and they fish there. These two engineers, Azam Alwash and Jassim Al-Assadi, won the Goldman Environmental Prize. It's considered the environmental Nobel. Now, it's a beautiful story. It's also not an easy story. A lot of people would like them to go away because when you go to Iraq today, and the reason why we went to Iraq, your tax dollars and mine, is because there are oil flares everywhere. And there's oil underneath those marshes. And this was after I finished my research down there, but while I was still writing the book, Jassim al-Assadi, who heads Nature Iraq, which is the NGO that they formed, was kidnapped, and he was held for 2 weeks. He was tortured every day with electroshocks, with the equivalent of waterboarding. It's not a very pretty story. All of them trying to make him give up his environmental work. Fortunately, through some ancient tribal connections, they were able to liberate him, and he's back there today because he refuses to give up. And do I have a couple more minutes?
Yes, 3.
Yeah. There's a story that is set in the Netherlands, actually several stories in the Netherlands, because it's a country that all the other countries in the world are turning to right now to figure out how they've managed to end up not drowning for the past 1,000 years. And it's actually fascinating. The book is going to have to tell you this story, but just getting to see all that dazzling technology. And yet their own engineers told me that they're perfectly safe till maybe 2050. And then after that, you know, they honestly don't know. But there's a woman named Marian Manesma, who I spent time with there, who heads an NGO called Urgenda, which means urgent agenda. And she did a couple of things that were considered to be impossible. And she just said, I thought they were possible. And basically she mobilized the entire country, thousands of plaintiffs, to sue their country under all these highfalutin agreements that the Netherlands had signed about preserving, about not exceeding their carbon limit by holding themselves within the sustainable limits. They sued them on the grounds saying that they were endangering the lives of their citizenry. And they won. The government of the Netherlands appealed on 29 grounds and didn't do anything until they lost in the appeals court. And then they went to the Supreme Court, and they lost there again. And as a result, the Netherlands instantly had to cut out 25% of their emissions, which they did then by just closing down coal-fired plants. It's a really good way to start. But Urgenda also had an agenda of things that you could do between now and 2050. And one of them involved putting solar panels on as many houses as possible. And I think at this point, I'm going to turn this over to Bill.
So I come in a good mood to begin with. And the Red Sox took 3 or 4 from the Yankees over the weekend, so there's that. This is a strange feeling for me, though, because I've spent most of my life as a professional bummer-outer of other people. And there is an immense amount to be extremely bummed out about right now. There are an unbelievable number of big, bad things happening on the planet and in this country. The climate crisis that I wrote the first book about back in the 1980s is doing exactly what scientists said it would do, just more and faster. We're seeing every day grim evidence of just how deep in this hole we've gotten. We're now starting to really attack the core fundamental systems of the Earth. The jet stream, the Gulf Stream, the other biggest systems on the planet are now flickering and faltering and wobbling as we raise the temperature. And it's a mess. And in our country right now, I cannot even really quite begin to believe what's happening here. I've obviously been alive a long time, and there have been moments when I haven't liked what was going on in our country, but there's never been anything even remotely comparable to what we're seeing now, and that's terrible. There's one big good thing happening on planet Earth at the same time, and that's the story that I'm interested in sharing, in part because I hope that we can make it big enough and fast enough to actually affect those other crises, the crisis of the climate and the crisis of democracy. The thing that's happening is the absolutely rapid, unprecedented spread of renewable energy. We've been waiting for this for 40 years, and in the last 36 months, it's finally happened. About 4 years ago, we passed some invisible line where it became cheaper on this planet to produce energy by the sun and the wind than by setting stuff on fire. We now live on a planet where the cheapest way to make power is to point a sheet of glass at the sun. And that really changed an awful lot. It could end up changing almost everything. In the last 36 months, the speed of this transition has been so remarkable that I think many people haven't been able almost to notice it because it doesn't fit with our image of things. We've been calling sun and wind alternative energy my whole life. That's the place where we've filed it away in our brains, but it's not alternative energy anymore. It's the obvious, common sense, straightforward way to produce energy. 95% of new generating capacity on this planet last year, both in this country and around the world, came from sun and wind and batteries. And in the places where we're really doing it, the numbers are incredible. California's taken this more seriously than any place in this country. They passed some kind of tipping point in the last 6 or 8 months. Now, every day, California produces more than 100% of its power for long stretches of the day from sun and wind and water. By nightfall, that means that the biggest source of supply on the grid are batteries that have been soaking up excess sunshine all afternoon, batteries that didn't exist 3 years ago. Bottom line, California, fourth largest economy on planet Earth, is using 40% less natural gas to produce electricity now than they were 2 years ago. That's the most encouraging statistic I've heard in 40 years of working on this stuff. California is no longer doing it fastest of any state, though. Texas has now taken over the lead. They're putting up clean energy as fast, and you know that it's not for ideological reasons. It's because it's the most compelling, cheapest, easiest way to build power. Nothing that's happening in this country comes anywhere close to comparing with what's happening in much of the rest of the world, especially China. China in May, which is the last month for which we had statistics, was putting up 3 gigawatts of solar power a day. A gigawatt's the rough equivalent of a coal-fired power plant, a big one. So they were building the solar equivalent of a coal-fired power plant every 8 hours in China in May. Forget petrostates. China is the world's first electrostate, okay? And it's remarkable to watch not only that surge of clean power, China's carbon emissions are now dropping, but also to watch them master all the things that go with it, the appliances that can make use of that electricity, most of all the EV. We're used to thinking of Detroit as the center of the automotive universe, but it no longer is. There's 3 or 4 cities in China whose names I have trouble pronouncing that are now where the future is being built. They're producing the cheapest, best cars on the planet, and they're dominating, as of 6 months ago, the market across the developing world for automobiles. The only reason that they're not dominating our market is because we won't let them in. It is remarkable to see it start to happen, and it is unbelievably good news that it's happening in as many places as it is. That makes it unbelievably bad news that we had the misfortune to elect the administration that we did at this particular moment, because they've taken it as their mission to try and stop or slow down this energy transition just when we need to be speeding it up. Look, they're not going to stop it permanently. 30, 40 years from now, we'll run this country like this world on sun and wind. But if it takes us anything like 30 or 40 years, then we'll be in that hole that Alan was describing, the sixth mass extinction, everything that goes with it. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change told us that if we wanted to have some hope of staying anywhere near the timetable that we set in Paris just a decade ago, we need to cut emissions in half by 2030, which by my watch is 4 years and 5 months from now, okay? So we have a ton of work to do, and we have exactly one set of tools to do it with. Nothing else except sun and wind and batteries is going to scale quickly enough to make any material difference in how much carbon ends up in the atmosphere and what the temperature settles at. We're not going to stop global warming. We may still be able to stop it short of the place where it cuts civilization off at the knees. That's an open question, and it depends entirely on the speed with which we move, which is why, and the real reason I'm here is just to enlist your help in this work. There's a lot of important political work going on right now, but one of the things that we need your help with, as Matt was saying, is this thing we're heading towards at the autumnal equinox, September 21st, which we're calling Sun Day. Sun Day, not Earth Day, but Sun Day. An effort across the country with hundreds and hundreds of actions everywhere to celebrate the world that we might be able to build and to move us much further towards it. We cannot do anything in Washington in the next 18 months. That waits at least till the next election. But there is a ton that we can do in state and local level to make this happen much more quickly. Just to give you the quickest examples, it costs 3 or 4 times as much to put solar power on your roof in America as it does in the EU or the US. This is not because the panels are more expensive. They're marginally more expensive because of tariffs. It's mostly because we have to go through this Byzantine Baroque permitting system. We have 15,000 municipalities, each with its own code. They all send inspector after inspector. It takes months. If you're in Australia or Italy, on Monday, you can call up your contractor and say, I want solar power on the roof, and by Friday, it's up there pumping power to the grid. That's why 40% of homes in Australia have solar on top. There's an app that the National Renewable Energy Laboratory developed under Biden that automates this process. It's called the Solar App Plus. California, Maryland, and New Jersey have now mandated its use. We can spread that across the country. Another example, apartment dwellers in Europe by the millions over the last 2 years have been putting up what's called balcony solar. They go to IKEA or Best Buy, come home for a few €100 with a panel designed to hang from the railing on their balcony. They just plug it straight into the wall. They're often producing 20 or 25% of their power. That's illegal every place in this country except the state of Utah, which 2 months ago, by unanimous vote of the state legislature, passed an enabling legislation to allow it to happen because some libertarian state senator stood up and said, why can the good people of Stuttgart and Frankfurt do this, but not the good people of Provo and Salt Lake City? There might be 1 or 2 libertarian legislators in the live free or die state that you could persuade to do something similar and get this done. The basic task, though, of this day is just going to be with e-bike parades, with tours of people's heat pumps, with ribbon cuttings at solar farms, just to move this out of the alternative energy category. We are used to thinking of this as the Whole Foods of energy. Nice but pricey, okay? It is the Costco of energy. It is cheap, it's available in bulk, it's on the shelf, ready to go. If we push, we can make progress. But we have to push because the other guys are pushing back really hard. I'm not the only one who knows that California is using 40% less natural gas. Exxon knows it too. That's why the fossil fuel industry, remember when candidate Trump said, give me $1 billion and I'll let you do anything you want to the oil industry last year? Well, they gave him about $500 million. And that was enough because they've gotten everything they've ever asked for, to the point of ludicrousness. Donald Trump put a stop work order on Friday on a wind farm off the coast of Rhode Island that was 95% complete, just because of all that money and because of his weird golf course obsessed hatred of clean energy. We have to stand up and make this change. And I'll just end by saying, with many thanks to my Third Act colleagues here, that one of the groups of people who have to stand up and make this happen are people my age. We started Third Act to organize Americans over 60 for action on climate and on democracy 3 years ago, and we've now got 100,000 people across the country. And it's possible there's a few people in that age group here in this room tonight. We need you. The rest of you, tell your grandparents. 3 days ago, Stephen Miller, the odious sidekick, the president, was boasting about how great it was that they had militarily occupied the District of Columbia. But he did say, the only problem we're having is a bunch of these elderly hippies who just keep showing up and protesting. He urged them all to go home and take a nap. I urge you all to stay out there in the street pushing as hard as you can to get done what needs doing. First and foremost, this transition away from fossil fuel. On the other side, not just a world that has some fighting chance to shave some tenths of a degree off how hot the planet gets, but also a world that works better in a lot of ways. I'll just end by asking you to use your imagination and think about how the geopolitics of our planet would have been different in the last 70 years if oil had been of trivial value. How many wars and assassinations and coup plots and terrorist groups and things we might have avoided. Human beings are very good at figuring out how to fight, but it's going to take some effort to figure out how to start a war over sunshine. That's the world that I very much want to leave behind, and we need everybody's help to make it happen. Thank you.
So get your questions ready. We're going to be coming to you for questions, but first, we're going to give these two a chance to interact with each other. Alan, maybe you want to respond to what you've heard from Bill, maybe ask a question or two, agree, disagree. Why don't you take the microphone, so to speak?
Well, there's the whole world to talk about here, isn't there? Just two little things from my book that I want to mention. I started my book before COVID. I was about 3 countries into my travels, and then I had to sit down for a couple of years, like we all did, and wait it out. But at one point, I just had to go somewhere. So I ended up going to upstate New York. Is that for me? I ended up going to upstate New York to see a bunch of farmers who were trying Uh, they were trying out a new product that came out of a lab in Berkeley, California, and it was a product to basically replace nitrogen fertilizer, which is part of the fossil fuel industry. Nitrogen fertilizer requires a great deal of inputs from fossil fuels, and then when the stuff degrades in the field, it sends up the third most important greenhouse gas into the atmosphere, nitrous oxide, involving a complex reaction with soil microbes, and then it goes downstream and it creates those horrible dead zones that we all know about. When I went to this area, this upstate New York, that was trying out this, it's a microbial brew that coats seed corn, and when you plant it and the seeds germinate, the microbes will colonize the roots, and they are nitrogen-fixing microbes. They're basically mimicking what legumes do. It was Trump country, wall to wall. I saw all the signs. And when I arrived there, they said to me, "Alan, didn't they tell you that this is a mask-free zone?" No. So I was in corn choppers interviewing these guys 2 feet away because they're screaming over the noise of the engine and all this stuff. But what they were showing me was that this stuff was working. The corn was much greener in the middle of the dry season. They weren't having to put that mid-season fertilizer pass, which meant lots less wear and tear on their tractors. For a farm of 1,000 acres, $56,000 less fertilizer. And the point of this story is that these were not people who were environmentally oriented. They were economically oriented. They were looking at the bottom line. And this new product was about half the price of fertilizer. So we don't have time to change everybody's politics, but we can show them that there are much better ways to do things. You know, as Bill was saying, with solar energy in Texas or wind energy in Texas. The other quick thing, and I owe Bill a great deal of thanks for this because he pointed me to Bangladesh. And the most hopeful story in my book, Hope Dies Last, is in the worst place I've ever been. And I've worked in over 60 countries. I've seen some really bad stuff. A Rohingya refugee camp where there are over 1 million people who were fleeing a genocide. And they were living in these plastic-covered huts that the United Nations High Commission on Refugees gave them, and they were stifling hot inside, except for this one sector that had these little solar panels and these little antennas on bamboo with a little responder on there. What it was a peer-to-peer of wireless network between all of these houses. Inside the solar panel was giving them fluorescent light, an electric fan, which was life-changing for them, and enough extra juice so they could plug in their cell phones or the kid could do homework on a pad. But most important was a box that allowed them, if they were running out of energy, wirelessly, they could push a button, they could buy some from their neighbors who had extra energy left in their storage battery that had been fired up by the solar panel. Or if they had extra, they could put it up for sale. Each house was surrounded by neighbors they were linked with. Each cluster of houses was surrounded by more and more and more. And unfortunately, the project ran into politics in Bangladesh. Fortunately, those politics are now easing. But this was leapfrog technology. It required no cables overhead. And it just made everybody happy by empowering them with the light of the sun. In Dhaka, the capital of Bangladesh, the company that designed this is now hooking up we think that EVs are going to happen with cars, rickshaws. So there are millions of rickshaws in India and Bangladesh. And what they are doing with them now is giving them the same equivalent of those solar batteries that they can buy and sell from each other, but they can also hook these things up at night. Any extra charge that's left in their batteries gets pushed into the grid. There's enough, potentially, there are enough rickshaws that they could be powering over a fifth of Bangladesh just by their mobile solar units that they are using to make a living. So there are a lot of ways to do this.
Bill, any responses to what you were hearing from Alan, please?
Just very quickly, because it's been great to get to a few. Just very quickly, it's so good to know that these technologies make sense for the richest parts of the world and for the poorest. Alan has extraordinary anecdotes, and I have extraordinary data about some of the stuff that's happening at scale. Pakistan, which used to be part of Bangladesh, Pakistan in the last year, Pakistan has an expensive and unreliable electricity system, and they're right next to China, where there's a huge amount of surplus of cheap solar panels. About a year ago, the flow of those really started to pick up. People who'd been exporting rice or cement started doing solar panels, and everybody started buying them. It wasn't a government program, and there weren't trained people there to kind of run the thing, but if you look at pictures on Google Earth, you can just watch this sprout on the rooftops of Lahore and Karachi and Islamabad. Within 8 months, Pakistanis, mostly using TikTok videos with Hindustani music in the background to kind of learn what they were doing, they'd installed the equivalent of half the country's national electric grid inside of 8 months. Pakistani farmers were the biggest first adopters because diesel was their biggest input cost. If you've been in rural Asia, you know that the sound of the diesel generator running the irrigation well is the kind of soundtrack of the countryside. That's expensive. So these guys were buying solar panels. They usually lacked the money to build the kind of metal supports that we're used to seeing. They just laid them on the ground, pointed them at the sun. Before the year was out, Pakistan was using 35% less diesel than they'd used the year before. That's the speed with which change is now possible, and the effect it can have on some of the poorest people. I mean, Pakistan, harder hit by climate change than any country on Earth. Routinely, temperatures now of 125 in the cities, the 2 worst floods since Noah in the last 15 years. That can shift like that is the kind of story we need to concentrate our minds. And truthfully, it makes me all the angrier to watch the kind of piggishness in our government at the moment and their insistence that everyone else around the world, we're using our tariff policy largely to shake down other countries into buying American liquefied natural gas, hundreds of billions of dollars at a time, instead of making this transition off fossil fuel. So it's a moment of extraordinary possibility if we push it.
All right, we're going to move to questions from the audience. My understanding is that Emerson is going to be Donahue or Oprah, take your pick. He's got a handheld mic. I think we're going to bring up the lights. Very good.
You go.
So think of your best question, raise your best hand, and Emerson he's right there. He's just coming around the bend. He'll appear shortly, and he'll spot you. Great. If you can speak into the mic and welcome.
Hi, thank you. You're both major inspirations in my life, so it's really great to hear you tonight. I have a question, I guess, for both of you, but mainly to Alan to start. I've read most of your books, and even in this one, you talk a lot about the transition back to a smaller population on the earth through non-draconian ways. And I'm curious how to answer the critics of that, because every time I read about declining populations, it's always mentioned with the term demographic crisis. And everybody says it's impossible for the future to be peaceful and verdant if we have fewer people on the planet, because no one will be able to take care of everyone. I don't quite understand it, but every time you read about it, it says demographic crisis, and I'm curious how you would respond to that.
The demographic crisis? Well, we're an example of a species that has become extraordinarily successful. You know, we, like every other species, in nature, creates a lot of copies of itself. And in the past, we had very big families because half the kids weren't going to survive to be old enough to have kids themselves. And we wanted, the species to continue on. We wanted our families and our legacies and our last names and all those things. Then in the 19th century, the beginning of the 19th century, we started learning how to overcome, what happens in nature. We developed a vaccine for smallpox that was quickly followed by several other vaccines, and I have nothing against medical, modern medicine, pasteurization of milk, all these things that meant that many fewer of us were dying. Infant mortality was cut way down, and our lifespans were expanding. I mean, that sounds like a really good thing. And then in the 20th century, we learned how to produce much more food than nature could ever produce by the amount of plant life on the planet is kind of limited to the amount of nitrogen that is naturally fixed, but this is where fossil fuels comes in. We learned how, with a great deal of energy expense, to pull nitrogen out of the atmosphere where there's an abundance of it, and to chemically slather it on the ground, and to nitrogen being an essential nutrient for plants. Well, in nature, whenever you increase the food supply, the population rises to meet the new food supply. And the founder of the Green Revolution, who then developed some plants that could produce even more grains per stalk, he warned, when he got the Nobel Peace Prize, he warned us that unless we managed population at the same time as we were improving foodstuffs, we were going to have a terrible problem, because people who don't die of famine then live to give birth to more people. So here we are. We quadrupled this past century, and now there's a whole lot of people on the planet that want food and they want energy. Bill has given you a way that we can energize ourselves. How we're going to grow enough food? Well, I got about 3 chapters in the book, and I'm not going to take the time right now, that describe how people are trying to come up with ways that do not damage the planet, in fact, enhance the planet by giving us new ways to produce food that will not continue to take away more space from more wildlife, because right now about half the unfrozen planet is devoted to feeding one species, and that's ours. It's going to be done without chemistry. It has to be done without chemistry, otherwise we're going to lose our pollinators. These are big problems, but we've got this problem. We can't cry about it. We have to gradually learn how to live within our means. And, it's a huge question, and I wrote a big book just to deal with that. That was my last book.
In the back?
Yes.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yes, I was wondering, what the effect of all these global wildfires are having on the climate crisis and how the Earth is going to hopefully recover. I'm wondering if anyone up there, any of you, have any understanding of what will evolve.
Was the question about wildfires?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So this is obviously exactly what happens when you warm the planet. The most obvious thing that we see around us as a result of climate change is the fact that warm air holds more water vapor than cold. So in arid areas, we get more drought, and when it gets hot enough, that almost inevitably leads to fire. And now we're seeing it obviously everywhere. Sometimes with astonishing sort of horror. It's a sign of the speed with which our news cycle is moving that we've seemed to have essentially forgotten that the second largest city in our country, huge parts of it burned to the ground in January. Now Europe is going through its biggest wildfire season ever, and probably most terrifying is what's happening in the far north. The boreal forests, which nearly have never burned because it should be wet and cold enough up there to keep them from burning, it's no longer that cold, and they begin drying out much earlier in the year, and hence they're much more likely to catch on fire. There's no way short of lowering taking the temperature burden off to keep that from happening. 10 Republican congressmen wrote an angry letter to the Canadians last month complaining about wildfire smoke coming across the border. Truthfully, at this point, I have no idea how Canadians even, keep their equanimity at all. But it's a huge problem, largely because it is a very strong positive feedback loop. So we don't have the numbers yet for 2025, but 2023 was the biggest year of Canadian wildfires, at least until now. And in 2023, Canada was the fourth largest carbon-producing country in the world, even though it has a population of 40 million people, because those forests were putting so much carbon up there. We have to take that pressure off by keeping the temperature from getting any higher than it's going to. And if we do, then some kind of forests will recover, but they won't be the same ones that we've had. And I will just add, without trying to sound scary or ominous about anything, driving across New England today was a reminder that there's not a river in New England right now that you can't hop across rock to rock. We're used to telling ourselves that we live in the asbestos forest and that it's too wet. I've been doing some hiking these last days in the mountains, and it is dry as hell out there. So we're not immune to this either. I wish there was some magic way to deal with this, but there isn't. The only way to keep things from getting worse is to keep the temperature as under control as we can. And the only tool we have to do that at scale is what we've been talking about tonight, the rapid transition off fossil fuel. I'll just add, too, that when you burn fossil fuel, you also send up another kind of smoke. We've now spent the summer worrying about, sucking in smoke from those Canadian wildfires and what's it doing to our lungs. 9 million people on this planet every year die from breathing the combustion byproducts of fossil fuel, mostly in the developing world. That's 1 death in 5 on the planet. There are 5 million children in New Delhi. 2.5 million of them have irreversible lung damage just from breathing the air. So if we can figure out, and as Alan was saying, we're beginning to, Delhi is rolling out electric rickshaws, things like that. If we can figure out how to do some of that, it helps in all kinds of other ways too.
Not to mention, people understand that forest fires make it hard to breathe. Burning fossil fuels is a forest fire.
Yes.
It's just slow motion, because coal and oil and gas are ancient forests and animals. So we're digging up the ancient forests and burning them. So it's kind of like we're causing Is forest fire.
That's why and as a good graduate of Harvard Divinity School, you'll appreciate that one of our mantras for Sunday is energy from heaven, not from hell.
I like
That's,
it. That's good. Enough hell already. Where's the next question?
Right here.
Go ahead.
We've just driven in from Salisbury, Vermont. I also took that same 3-hour drive over, and I know that's your area, Bill. And one of the things that strike me, we moved to Vermont 5 years ago, and a very green place, a very politically aligned with our views. But I get up every day and I see miles and miles of cow pasture. I see moo glue being spread on the fields, I think, and I can smell it a lot of times, a couple times of the year. And then I see big piles of wood that are going to be thrown into a fireplace and heating homes, and it's a tradition. Not only that, but we have sugaring houses that are all sending out, lots and lots of wonderful smelling steam, but all using wood burning. How do we I understand the way you can change hearts and minds with, looking at the economy of it, the economic side of it, and we all appreciate that, but how do you change the things people have been doing for hundreds of years in a certain way, in a place that certainly embraces green energy and such. But
It's a good question. My advice actually on this would be don't worry about it too much. The thing to worry about in Vermont and New Hampshire is what's not in the fields, which is solar panels and wind turbines. Vermont's been irresponsible. It's had a de facto moratorium on wind turbines for 15 years because people don't want to look at them. It's hard as hell to develop solar farms. And the people will routinely say, well, it's because we don't want to use ag land for solar panels. That's nuts. We have, what we grow, say, in Vermont is basically corn and hay to feed cows to produce milk. We have more milk than we know what to do with, okay? What we don't have is a good crop of clean electrons. And so one of the things that we need to we need to change our aesthetic here at some level. One of my favorite parts of this book was spending a kind of field trip, a couple of days in Vermont with neighbors of mine who have set up a nonprofit to run pollinator-friendly plantings in between the rows of solar panels on solar farms. Remember, on an overheated planet, shade is a valuable commodity, and now we have a new way of producing it, and it retains water and things. These plantings are doing remarkable things. The number of pollinating insects, many of which we thought had been extirpated from Vermont, have increased by orders of magnitude. And as a result, the fruit set on orchards around the borders is up 30 and 40%. The amount of clean energy that you can generate if we do this, and the carbon savings dwarf what we get by shutting down sugar houses, which you're never going to be able to do. If there's, I'm all for eliminating combustion. That's sort of my crusade. But there are a few things that we can, burn wood for. I got to say, I'm in the party that thinks probably maple syrup is, the tiny little bit of wood that we're actually using to do that might kind of be worth it in the end. I'm going off to the Vatican to see the new Pope, and they've just made Vatican City the first by the end of the year, will be the first fully solar-powered nation on Earth. But I'm pretty sure they're going to keep burning candles, and I think that probably sugar shacks are the kind of Vermont equivalent of, and in the Granite State as well, So, but good for you to be thinking about it. Just push people to, because many farmers actually want to do this, and it's their neighbors who keep saying, I don't want to look at it, that get in the way. It really is time for, and here, I speak to my tribe, old, well-educated white people to stop suing people to prevent things that they don't want to look at. Just let this stuff happen. It's really important to get done.
Thank you all so much for giving us hope. There's an area I need some hope for, which is AI. Every time I go online to look something up, AI is answering it first, and it's consuming so much energy, and we're just going in that direction. Can you speak to the AI issues, please?
You go, I'll go.
One of the people that I went to visit for this book was the head of Google's AI climate program, a guy named John Platt, who was this extraordinary human being who had started college when he was 14 and got his PhD when he was 18, and he's the guy who put touch into your touch pads. I mean, his stories just go on forever. And he left a great job at Microsoft because Google gave him this opportunity to try to see if AI can help with climate. And so far, it's been limited. It can help with efficiency a great deal. They were able to solve about half the emissions of contrails by just simply having AI redirect flights around patches of freezing atmosphere that would then cause a contrail to form. But at a certain point, there's only so much that artificial intelligence can do. In the meantime, this is something that is now here, and it's part of the ecosystem that we are going to have to learn to live with. And I have it by good authority by a book that I just read called Here Comes the Sun, that we may not have to worry about it as much as I was already worrying about it, just like you, because the solar capacity that we are capable of developing may be able to run all those data centers without completely frying us in the future. I mean, that's really exciting when you can think of that, because there are a lot of, I've got a chapter about fusion energy in my book. I mean, there are a lot of things that might be able to happen if we can buy some time. And the fastest way that we can buy some time is to buy some solar panels.
But Alan's absolutely right, but we have to actually do it, and at the moment, we're not. We're in the middle of this insane contradiction on the first day of taking office, President Trump declared a national energy emergency because of AI. We need more power. All holds barred, let's get more power so we don't fall behind on AI. And then at the same time, he essentially outlawed new solar and wind, not only the cheapest way to do it, but the only way to do it quickly. You can build a solar farm in 6 months. You build a gas generating station, it could take you 5 years. So the resulting constriction is electricity demand goes up, and the price of electricity is going to go through the roof, and it's up about 10% around the country this year already, thanks to this blockheadedness. It would actually be a pretty good lever to build a lot of renewable capacity fast. But I'll just add, there probably are some tasks for which AI may have some help. I'm unbelievably unimpressed with the large language model parts of it so far. And people keep saying to me that it's going to help with I think when we finally get the very smart AI someday in the future, and someone sits down and asks it, what should we do about the climate crisis? It's going to spit back out build more solar panels, idiots, and that'll be that. I think our native intelligence has already produced most of the answers that we need here going forward.
There is a technological analog to the Heritage Foundation and President Trump trying to keep solar panels out of the United States, particularly the Chinese version. And if you don't know about it, the Chinese EVs are just extraordinary, and they are everywhere except for here. I know Bill made that point before, but we can't make it enough. The rest of the world is making us look like what we used to call Russia, a third world country that happens to be a superpower. I mean, it's just ridiculous how far ahead the rest of the world is from us. The analog that I was going to mention was something called deep fake. I can't remember exactly what it is. DeepSeek, thank you. It's a Chinese large language AI program that uses about 1/10 of the energy as the ones that we are using, not just for that stuff that shows up on your computer screens all the time when you try to go back to what Google used to be, but also, cryptocurrency, which you may have noticed the president is also pushing.
It's, by the way, so amazing that we're now nostalgic for what Google used to be back in the olden days.
Well, but here we are. We are numerous, and we've got all of these incredible, dazzling tools, which at one point in my book, I wonder, well, is this just the candle that is just burning a little brighter before it flickers out? It doesn't have to be.
That's it.
The fact, when we worry about what's the world going to be like when we lose our forests, all of these questions, what we have to focus on is the fact that we are here now, and there is something that we can do. And one of the things that we have to do, since we happen to live in the United States, is take our country back. I am...
Third act, baby.
Well, if Bill McKibben had done nothing more than write The End of Nature and those other wonderful books and help midwife 350.org into existence, that would have qualified him for sainthood. But Third Act is now something that really we have to all be part of. If we're not old enough, then we donate to it, and if we are, then we get involved with it, because we have to stand up to our elected officials and tell them this is what we need and we will not accept any less. We absolutely have to do it.
Well, I wouldn't, yeah, there we go. I wouldn't rule out sainthood, since he is meeting with the Pope, I heard. So we have time for one more question. Do we have one final question?
There's one right
Emerson?
in the middle of the aisle. There's a couple.
I think Emerson's got the mic. Yeah. Okay, go for it.
Just shout it out. We'll hear.
You can shout it out.
Yeah,
Big voice.
probably less echo if you shout it out.
Big oil and big gas companies really see the writing on the wall when it comes to fuel. So they're looking at more plastic pellets, and they envision a big increase in the production of plastic pellets that are made into all the plastic that we are consuming and using. What do you have to say about that?
Can I respond?
Yeah, you go.
Yeah. There are a couple of chapters in my book about feeding ourselves from the sea. there's also a chapter about building floating cities that instead of getting swamped by the sea are going to rise with them. But the sea tends to looms large in our future. And one of the things that I talk about in a chapter about seaweed, turns out that there's like 12,000 some species and they're all edible, and we only eat about 6 of them just at sushi bars. But another thing that can be done with seaweed is you can turn it into plastic. And you can turn it into plastic that is so good, it can do everything. It can be shrink wrap, you name what it can do. And eventually, if we don't recycle it and it finds its way back to the ocean, it biodegrades into the stuff of seaweed. Now, technologically, they have solved this. They've even solved how to make those little pellets, the nurdles that I talked about in The World Without Us. And there's a big European plastic company that is now shifting to work with the seaweed people to do this thing. It's going to take some subsidies to make this happen. But guess what? Plastic and the oil industry are the most subsidized. Your tax dollars have been paying for them all this time. Worldwide, I can't think of the US figure right now, but worldwide, it's about $6 trillion worth of subsidies a year. I mean, this is crazy. Think of the good things we can do, like seaweed plastic, if we shift the money there.
And Alan's exactly right. It all becomes a question around power. And if you want to keep the oil industry from being able to exert that power, you've got to make them less powerful. The easiest, quickest way to do that is to deprive them of the cash flow that comes from their main product. That's one of the things that's really nice about building out sun and wind fast. One of the reasons, maybe the biggest reason that we've ended up in a society as unequal as the one that we inhabit is that we depend on these resources that are only available in a few places. The people who control them get too much power. John D. Rockefeller was the kind of beginning of this in the modern world. But our biggest oil and gas barons in this country for the last 3 decades have been the Koch brothers. They control more refining and pipeline capacity than anyone else. And they used their winnings to erode the foundations of our democracy, making them very easy for Donald Trump to kick over when the time came. So we got to take that back. And one of the ways to do it is to build out a energy system that's available to everyone, everywhere, and that cannot be hoarded or held in reserve. That's the promise of what we have. Now, I've got to dash out of here because I'm headed back to Vermont first thing in the morning to go do some work with Bernie to get ready for Sunday. We're going to film it. And Bernie is the guy, I think, in our political system who has stood up the longest and the loudest against that inequality. And it's no accident that from the beginning, he's also been constantly talking about climate change and about energy, because he understands how deeply intertwined these things are. This is the fight. This is why at Third Act, the 2 things we work on are climate and democracy. They're deeply, deeply intertwined. There's huge danger, but there's also huge opportunity. We actually could really not just talk about a different world, but kind of quickly build one. So let's do. That's it. Thank you, guys. Thank you, Alan. Brother, thank you. Many thanks. Cheers. Great.